Have you noticed that everyone suddenly seems to have a psychological disorder? Half my friends describing someone they dislike reach for the same word. Not difficult, not selfish, but narcissist. Others blame ADHD for their inattentiveness, their lateness, their messiness. And over the past couple of years, 4 children in my immediate circle have been referred to a psychologist to be assessed for autism. This is not confined to my circle. Instagram and YouTube are full of content such as 5 signs you have ADHD, or how to know you're autistic by masking, or how to spot a narcissist. Similarly, worldwide search interest in ADHD, autism, and narcissists has been climbing for years. So I wonder, what is going on? Are we experiencing an epidemic of psychological disorders? Or is seeking these diagnoses some sort of weird trend? And in both cases, why is this happening? This is what I want to explore today. Let's start by looking at the evidence for the top trending disorders I mentioned before: narcissism, ADHD, and autism. Have we, in fact, seen an increase of diagnosis in recent years? With narcissism, the story here is relatively short. There is no solid evidence that narcissistic personality disorder or narcissistic traits more broadly have clearly risen over the past 20 years. Clinical narcissism is estimated to affect roughly 0.5 to 5% of the general population, depending on which study you look at. Narcissistic traits are much more common than clinical narcissism, but there is no single reliable population percentage because traits exist on a spectrum and depend on how they are measured. Put simply, we cannot confidently say narcissism has risen. Clinical narcissism is not reliably tracked over time. Prevalence estimates vary by method and sample, and studies on narcissistic traits have produced mixed results. People with strong narcissistic traits may also be less likely to seek help for those traits directly, or may enter therapy because of relationship conflict, depression, anger, or other problems, rather than because they identify themselves as narcissistic. So the plain answer is we just do not know for sure whether narcissism has increased, and the evidence does not justify claiming that it clearly has. For ADHD and autism, it's different. Both have risen sharply. Take ADHD. In the United States, about 1 in 9 children now carries the diagnosis, up by 1 million in just 6 years. And adult diagnoses also keep climbing. Autism is more dramatic still. The childhood rate has gone from roughly 1 in 150 around the year 2000 to 1 in 31 today. In Britain, recorded diagnosis rose nearly 800% in 2 decades. Some of that reflects changes in diagnostic coding and improved recording, but the trajectory is real. To understand the drivers of this increase, it's interesting to look at where those increases are happening. They're happening disproportionately in milder cases that previously were not considered pathological, and in groups that were missed before, such as women. So on the one hand, we get better at spotting cases more objectively throughout the population and not just in hyperactive boys as we previously did. That's a good thing. But where I have doubts is the increase in the mild cases, which could mean that the net has grown too wide, that the criteria have loosened until ordinary human variation starts to qualify as a disorder. And there's evidence to support this worry. A 2021 review of more than 300 studies concluded that ADHD is now overdiagnosed in children, and that for the mildest cases, the harm of the label can outweigh the help. Even one of the psychiatrists who helped write the official diagnostic manual has spent years warning that the boundary has drifted too far. We have similar evidence for autism. A 2019 review argued that the autism category has expanded so far that people with much milder symptoms are now being diagnosed, and warned that this may dilute services for those with the greatest needs. Other studies have found that recorded autism diagnosis rose even when measured autistic traits in the population did not rise in the same way. So this is not just better detection. At least some of the increase looks like diagnostic expansion, where the boundary has shifted and people who might once have been seen as socially anxious, eccentric, rigid, or unusually sensitive are now given a lifelong neurodevelopmental label. So the rise in diagnosis probably doesn't mean that humanity has suddenly become more disordered. It is partly a real correction. People who were missed before are now being recognized. But it's also partly expansion. More ordinary distress, Social awkwardness, impulsivity, sensitivity, and difficult personality traits are being interpreted through clinical labels. Underlying both is a cultural shift. There seems to be increased motivation to pathologize people. And the clearest signal for this is that the volume of pathological talk in society is even more than the increase in diagnosis. This suggests culture is driving the language, not just the diagnosis. Because even if every ADHD and autism diagnosis were completely sound, it would still not explain how casually we now use psychiatric language in everyday life. Calling people narcissists, diagnosing friends with ADHD, describing awkwardness as autism, or treating normal sadness, stress, conflict, and insecurity as symptoms. The diagnosis numbers may have risen, but the pathological talk has exploded. That suggests the real question is not medical, it is cultural. Why are we now so eager to diagnose ourselves and each other? Why does a clinical label feel more persuasive than a character description, a life problem, an unusual habit, or ordinary human difference? And why, even without a clinical basis, do we increasingly reach for pathology first? I think because a clinical label makes it easier to cope in an age that is high on self optimization, but low on purpose and human connection. It offers relief. I'm not lazy, I have ADHD. It offers identity. This explains who I am. It offers belonging. There's a whole community like me. It protects the ego. My child isn't difficult. I think he's neurodivergent. It can help devalue others. My ex wasn't selfish, he was a narcissist. Sometimes these conclusions are true, but often they're not. And the appeal is clear. The clinical version sounds more legitimate, and it lifts the shame. The pattern goes beyond the three labels I mentioned. The word neurodivergent has become very widespread, and it serves a peculiar double function. On the one hand, it celebrates our difference as identity, framing it as simply a different kind of mind rather than a flaw. But on the other hand, it labels that difference as a clinical condition. So it celebrates individualism and pathologizes at the same time. The problem with pathology becoming mainstream is this. If everyone is neurodiverse, we have long stopped talking about pathology and simply found new words to describe diverse characters. Actually, the US main psychiatric classification manual, DSM, itself shows it. The first edition in 1952 listed 106 diagnoses across 130 pages. By 1980, that had risen to 265. Today, it runs over 1,000 pages. This could mean we have just gotten more nuanced at classifying psychological disorders. But developing more pathological labels also opens the doors to applying those labels more broadly. There are many researchers who share this skepticism. For example, one of Britain's leading autism researchers, Francesca Harpay, warns that we may be sliding from describing real conditions to medicalizing ordinary eccentricity. She points out that these traits sit on a continuum where the line is a judgment call, and that we may already have more people self-identifying as neurodivergent than as neurotypical. Combine autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and a few typical people remain. But the consequences of over-pathologizing healthy people with clinical diagnosis goes beyond just expanding our vocabulary. The deeper cost is that we're getting better at naming disorders and worse at understanding people. The first cost of this pathologization trend is moral simplification. The cruelest version is the narcissism label aimed at other people. Because if your ex was selfish, you might have to weigh context and conflict and your own part in it. But if your ex is a narcissist, the story gets simple. He's the pathology. You're the injured party. End of analysis. And children are the most exposed of all. We label them with a disorder before their personalities have even formed, teaching them early that the difference is a defect. The second cost. Labels become excuses for behavior. The person who's late to everything, except somehow never late for work. And it is the ADHD. The parent whose child is struggling, and it is the diagnosis, not the parenting. Either way, the work of changing gets handed to the clinician. Another problem is that medicalizing ordinary flaws can actually increase pressure. If ordinary weakness is now a disorder, then ordinary humanity becomes less acceptable, not more. This also explains why some people who receive a diagnosis celebrate it with pride or relief. It offers a ticket out of the perceived wheel of societal expectations. But that ticket has a cost over time, fragility. Not as weakness, but as a trained incapacity. The belief that difficulty is a condition to be explained rather than an experience to be navigated. Think of it this way. If someone repeatedly loses their temper with the people closest to them, and we tell them it is because they're neurodivergent, we give them a framework. But a framework is not the same as change, and the people on the receiving end of that temper still have to live with it. Every time a character trait is reclassified as a disorder, the implicit lesson is that you are not equipped to handle it without a framework. At scale, that lesson lowers the threshold for what people can bear. Not because life has gotten harder, but because we have been taught that difficulty is always a sign that something is wrong. Meanwhile, the people with severe, genuine illness get crowded out. Real disorders are diluted. Limited support is handed out by label instead of by need. My own test before reaching for a diagnosis is this. Is there real suffering that needs treatment which I can't give myself? If I want the label but not the treatment, then there probably wasn't so much suffering, only a search for a story. Because what the label does not build is resilience. It does not teach you that you can navigate your own difficulty, only that your difficulty has a name. And a self you own, you can work with. A condition you have, you cannot. For me, the goal is not more categories, more fragility. It is to be a little more resilient, and a great deal more accepting of the fact that people are simply different. Most difference is not disorder. Know the difference and build from there.